I'm from Iconomical. That's a small business in Amsterdam. We develop tools for exploring high volumes of aggregated information. And the idea is basically to deliver tools that have perspectives and contexts for supporting analysis and discovery, and in doing so offer explanations around data. We can make use of these kinds of tools to discover the trends and exceptions and relationships that happen really behind the scenes in the data that we're actually making use of. And other things we can use it for are for browsing applications, where basically you can actually use visualizations to find items by drilling down through things. So also you can use it to find needles in haystacks. And this isn't really the same as data journalism or making infographics, because the volume of data involved, what we need to do is actually make tools that can really support exploring the unknown. So as well as communicating what we do know, we've got to make sure that we can find what we don't know. So to give you an example of the kind of things we work on, this is a recent version of the public spending model that we've been working on. This is a visualization of the Tanzanian budget. I don't know how well you can see it at the back there. It's a very simple interface, and it's actually displaying some very complex data. So this kind of should give you some idea of how we can construct scalable user experiences around this idea of exploration and analysis. I'm going to come back to this and give you a detailed demonstration of this in a bit, but first I want to talk a bit about the general rules of engagement of what we do, talk about some usage context, and what it really means to work with large volumes of data. So in our work, we look for ways to view the bigger picture, but also to drill down and discover the details. And what we've discovered is that the data really can and does speak for itself, but only if we, as designers and users, can actually examine it in a relevant way. So it's not enough to give people basic visualization tools and let them get on with it themselves. You have to basically frame the data and give it the right shape, so that what you're actually giving it is a form that people can understand it. And we're also very, very keen on using interactivity so that real exploration can happen. And in doing this, we think we can support learning and understanding, and also improve data literacy and make it easier for people to understand through learning. So as I say, we aim to deliver interfaces which really can deliver everything at once in the databases, but also in its proper context. So in other words, this means show as much as possible, but as I say, it's framed correctly in its correct form. And we need to have ways of comparing the very large and the very small, and also understanding the relationships that work in between. And you need to be able to zoom in and out and view data at different levels and navigate through it by slicing and dicing and so forth. So interfaces really need affordances which allow for advanced exploration, but also present information in a meaningful way, which supports the learning process, rather than asking users to do too much. So while I feel that we're definitely in a grey area here, I do believe that what we're doing at Iconomical is more science than art, because we're concerned with evidence. And at the outset, we found, when we're analysing a project, it helps to be as objective as possible. And if you try and cherry-pick your data to suit whatever message you want to put across, then you do run a grave risk of missing something very crucial and losing some vital details and clues. Now, this may be desirable if you're making journalism, and it might well be what you're working towards in your end product. But if you want to make a scalable investigative tool, it's a really good idea at the outset to park your preconceptions at the door and do the hard work of cleaning, processing, and analysing first. Because we're not in the business of making things up, we're actually in the business of solving problems. So, like science, we're really all about evidence. So, I guess I'd like to deliver an important warning at this point, which is basically that when you're dealing with large volumes of data, and we're talking tens of thousands of data items here, you can never be entirely sure what you're going to find. And if you think you are, you risk getting it actually rather wrong and missing some important aspects of the story that your data has to tell. Because dynamic visualization is all about creating these spaces for for discovery. This voyage into the unknown, which makes the kind of investigation very useful, but it makes it risky at the same time. Because ultimately we can make data more usable and data production more accountable, but you have to be prepared for some surprises. So because we have an awful lot of data, it doesn't always do what you expect it to do, or what you might initially think of as interesting or as on message, and it may turn out to be exactly the opposite of what you're actually thinking. And because we're actually dealing with this level of uncertainty, we need strategies for dealing with it. And you need to basically form user journeys to lead people into this unknown space by navigating through what we already know. And I don't think anybody's put this any better than Donald Rumsfeld. So what I'd like to show you next are a couple of projects which we did about the same time, which I hope will show you the two sides of this knowing and not knowing. So this is a presentation we did for a business conference hosted by the former British Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. And it's linked data from multiple different sources. Linked data means that it's basically semantic web resources, and we like working with those because it means we can pull data from lots of different areas, and also because it has already standardized frameworks that we can work with. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to show you some of this so that you can see the interactivity at work. Now, okay, now you probably can't see it on this screen, and I can't see it either, so that makes it a little bit complicated. Let me see if I can get the playhead working. Oops. Oh, what's happening here? Sorry? Make it smaller. Because I've lost my, there's a little control down here in the corner, right here, which I can't get at. I can't see it. Oh, up. Needs a bit more. Up a bit. Up a bit. Right. Oh, goodness. Oh, we are in trouble. Let's see if we can scroll this. Yes, as we scroll down. Okay. So, yay, playhead. Right, so what we have down here is you have a little playhead. And this is actually, just to explain what this is visualising, this is visualising project activity and research funding throughout the UK. So what you're actually seeing here is basically all the projects taking place. You can also zoom in and you can actually start to see these in their actual proper locations as projects taking place at businesses and universities. And you can filter this according to several different domains. Let's scroll down again so you can see what the domains are. And we've got plastic electronics, regenerative medicine, advanced composite materials, and this rather poor relation RFID, which isn't actually going anywhere. Now, if I just go back to the playhead and play it to the end, you can see what's actually going on. By pulling the playhead, you can actually navigate through the timeline, and you can basically, by zooming in on the map, you can actually start selecting these sorts of things. So what we've done is we've sort of framed a few basic, very simple interactive paradigms around this data and made this little presentation. Now, a couple of things I want to draw to your attention. First of all, this graph on the right-hand side, this can't help but go up. So basically, that's a sort of little tiny bit of propaganda there to begin with. And secondly, the other thing is that they insisted that we put RFID in there. And none of us on the project team, that was us and our collaborators at Thales, were particularly keen on this idea, and we didn't know quite what this was all about. And we were fairly sure that this wasn't going to work, but there it is, it's right there, and it's not actually doing anything. If you look very closely, you can see a little slice of yellow down there, and you can see this teeny tiny little stack there. So this kind of indicates the risk of actually going into one of these projects and deciding what picture you actually want to paint before you do the data analysis. So at this point, we're looking at something that we didn't know at the beginning. We had a suspicion about it, but we went ahead and did it anyway. So that kind of gives you a feeling for the kind of risks that are involved there on that side. Now, the other side of this is that around about the same time, around about the same time, there was an enormous earthquake in Haiti. And in the aftermath of this earthquake in 2009, we actually had a customer who was desperate to know what they didn't know in their data. And because an awful lot of the infrastructure had actually been damaged, and they were dealing with a fairly similar model, which was basically projects over time. And they had a big spreadsheet, almost similar in format to what the material we had with the BIS project. And they wanted to be able to track these ongoing projects because the infrastructure in Haiti was so badly destroyed that they didn't actually know what projects were going on the ground. So what we did was we took basically the same model as we actually worked on for the BIS project. And we actually made a similar filter for basically the project domains, and we had the timeline filter on the bottom. But what we did, instead of actually making much use of the map, because we didn't have the locative information, we actually replaced the timeline visualization with something a bit different. And I'm just going to try and show you how this works a little bit. Okay, Haiti Development Browser. Right, okay, so what we've done here is we've actually visualized all of the projects which are going on over the relevant time period on this sort of Gantt chart. It's a little bit faint here, so you can't really tell, but things start to get interesting when you start to drill down. Because what we've done is we've got donors, the people who are actually funding the projects, and the recipients of the money who are supposed to be effectively running them. So basically, all of these acronyms are agencies, and I'm sorry I have to make that explicit, but we didn't really know how else to fit it in. But the point is that by actually filtering on any one of these agencies, you can see who it is they're funding down here, and you can actually see any one of the projects which are going on. So what we can do is we can actually start filtering by donor or recipient. We can see which domain the project is in. That's not such a great example. But what you can see here is that whoever it is, ACDI, whose money is coming back to MENF, I don't know what all these things stand for, but I can see that these are all the projects, and they are all more or less in the domain of education. And by clicking on that, I can actually find a bit about the details of the project. So basically, this should give you an idea how a visual browser can actually allow you to go and find things that you don't know by asking relevant questions about things that you do know. So, anyway, back to the presentation. Okay, so now I'd like to talk a little bit about what it actually means to work with the data. We're all hearing an awful lot about basically open data and stuff is actually being released and how much is coming available, and there's a huge amount of material that's actually in the public domain. And as we know, this can actually potentially have a huge value to society at large, and everybody really likes transparency, especially governments who have tons of data. They want to put it all out there and want to see it getting used. And international organisations and NGOs, ditto, they want to keep us all informed about what's going on. And but it's not always easy to know what to do with all this stuff. But to give a little bit of context to what's going on, I'd like to sort of step back in time and talk about some ancient history from 2007. This is the public information, the Power of Information Review. Are people aware of this? Aware of the Power of Information Review? Nobody's blank looks, okay. So this was a review about public sector information and what we can do with it. It's actually a very, very influential report, and if you're interested in actually making use of information from the government to sort of do some community empowering project or whatever, then I do recommend that you read it, because it's a very, very interesting and very forward-thinking report. And basically it's really how data can be used in this local activism and so forth. And following this report, which, as I say, was very influential, it shaped a lot of policy. There was a task force set up by Tom Watson MP, and there was some momentum, and Some of this seems to have survived the change of government, so everybody still sees huge potential in actually putting public data actually out there into the public domain. But it's very, very hard to actually realise the benefits, because what we know is that more information doesn't necessarily lead to better decisions. Better analysis leads to better decisions. You have to do your homework, and data analysis can actually carry huge costs, and very often the benefits are very, very difficult to quantify. And furthermore, public data does need to be reliable and authoritative. So options for crowdsourcing stuff are actually very limited. If stuff comes from the government, it comes from the government. So this is kind of an elephant in the room, that basically there's quite a responsibility around data. Even though reuse carries added value, ownership does mean responsibility. And so while we can actually make great use of public data simply by reusing it, the buck kind of stops with the information owners, because crowdsourcing, as I said, it's not always an option. So opening data does actually carry costs and responsibilities, and it's very important that we recognise it's very hard to make data self-sustaining. Costs a lot of money to deliver good data. I can tell you this because we're working all the time with data, and we are when we go through a lot of these projects, we find very, very often that people don't really know what's in their databases. They don't know much about the data quality, and it costs them an awful lot of time and effort, and therefore resources, to actually build that up. So having said that, there are really some great projects out there. And a great example of open government data is the London Gazette, which is the UK government's paper of record. Now, I'm going to draw your attention to those words published by authority up there, because that's what I mean. You can't crowdsource this. So this carries all sorts of announcements. Historically, it was begun by James I, and since 1665, it's actually been reporting all sorts of things. At this point, it's actually reporting the Battle of Waterloo, but these days it's nothing like so historically important. It's actually just simply carrying things that it's required by law to announce, like, for instance, permit applications, urban planning, business incorporation, insolvency, stuff like this. So this is data which is actually very, very popular among the business community, and it's also, if you can actually get into this information, it carries a lot of weight on what is actually, it's a very, very reliable record of sort of business and legal activity around the country. But it's not really making history unless you count what they started doing a couple of years ago, which was a guy called John Sheridan at OPSI, the Office of Public Sector Information, started converting all of this to RDF, making an enormous semantic web resource out of this with an ontology that basically described the whole of public legislation. So it's a very, very ambitious project and really rather marvellous. So we actually made a little browser for this. I'm not going to demonstrate this, but if you're curious about it, I'm very happy to talk about it later. But what we did was we actually visualised a section of their archive, which was dedicated to pollution prevention and control. And the reason we did this was over a particular time period, there was a change in legislation, basically associated with the agricultural industry and livestock. So there's an awful lot of reports about pigs and chickens. So what you can see here is a filter applied to poultry farms and pig farms, and basically how everything is displayed on a timeline. Timeline down here, and map over here, and you can actually sort of make the whole timeline browsable and filterable, and you can find out all sorts of things. You can actually work the filter itself. We put all sorts of Boolean logic in there, and it's very, very powerful. So I actually quite enjoyed testing it to its limits, because if you really, really work on this, you can find the one factory in the UK in that time period that actually was burning hazardous waste. And you can also find Sellafield in there as well. So it's quite fun to actually go in there and find out really what's going on in terms of pollution. So it's very, very easy to see with an application like this how open data can be very empowering for governments and policymakers, and people who have an interest in sort of finding out, understanding more about how the country works. But it's much, much harder to see how open data can really empower communities. And there's been a lot of discussion sort of backwards and forwards lately, and there's probably, I believe, Tim, are you going to do a... Yes, you are, yeah. So Tim is going to be talking about this later, is basically how this idea of openness, unless we can make use of the data, it's very, very difficult for communities to actually benefit from these kinds of initiatives. However, I'm now going to talk about the wonderful Plings project. Is Stephen Flower in the audience? No, he's not. Okay, too bad. I was going to give him a shout because this is a wonderful project which is happening right here in Manchester. And it's a great example of how we can apply open data principles in practice. It's basically about places to go and things to do for young people in their free time. And the Substance Cooperative have been doing a fantastic job of gathering data from local authorities and event organisers, and it fills a niche for data providers and end users. But this gives us a huge, huge challenge of actually making use of the data. There's tons and tons of data out there, and it's very, very hard to actually find your way around it. So how do you do that? Well, users are absolutely fantastic at browsing. And if we have a look at the dictionary definition, it kind of implies passive consumption and maybe a little bit of bovine behaviour or something like that, attention deficit disorder and so forth. So users tend to be sort of quite passive and very limited in their attention, but they absolutely love to click on things, and interactivity is a wonderful, wonderful way of teaching people about what they're looking at, because you can give instant feedback. And I think this often gets overlooked in what we're doing with visual analysis and infographics these days. I get quite disappointed when I see yet another static infographic. Users, while they may find it hard to interpret data, they are actually very sophisticated in how they interact, and if you give them simple ways of making comparisons, they'll learn as they go. So this is a visualisation we've done of the Plings network. Let me see if I can get the demo to work. Okay, yeah, the map doesn't always behave itself so well. We're using cloud-made maps here because they're the nice OpenStreetMap format, but they don't always perform brilliantly. So what you can see here are sort of clusters of events, and we've organised them onto timeline here as well. So if, for instance, let's start drilling down into the local area. And also we can start calling up some keywords as well by things to do. So what we've got a keyword overlay. So supposing we want to have a go at some martial arts, then we've now got a set of keywords which are associated with martial arts. So we can see that sports development and kung fu, taekwondo. So we can see there's lots and lots of martial arts type activities we can get involved in by sort of drilling down and finding what the associated keywords are. So if I just hide that, then I've got my martial arts filter set there, and I can see where all the martial arts activity in this neighbourhood are and what time they're happening on this timeline down here. So if I want to say I want to do martial arts on Saturday morning, I can see where that happens. So this actually addresses the where, the what, and the when of places to go and things to do. So this is basically, quite a scalable thing. It's taking quite a large data feed. At one point we had, I think, something like 20,000 activities per week. At this point it's rather less. I think if anybody can find Stephen, then he'll be able to talk to you more about this project. So that is another one. So now we're going to talk about this other platform we've been working on, which is the public spending model, which I mentioned in the beginning. So I hope we've now got a bit of context around what the issues are about building these kinds of things, because we can now move on to an area where rigorous data analysis becomes very, very important, because this is really very, very complicated. So this project of modelling public spending actually spun off from a prototype we made for the original Where Does My Money Go project. And that was actually, that was quite a difficult project in its own way because of the data we have access to. It had already been curated, and it didn't quite tell the story that we wanted it to. But what people really, really want to know about public spending is basically who's spending the money, where are they spending it, and what are they spending it on. And the closer you can get to the ground, the better. So we're actually developing models around the data that's available that helps people to answer these questions for themselves and in detail. So now we're going to go and talk about the Tanzanian application. This model comes from the Tanzanian budget. Our client is an NGO with a remit for government transparency. This follows on from the project which I described, and what we've done here is actually made a much more complete and integrated model than the last one. And we're trying to be as open as and accessible about it. So let's take a look at that. Here we go. Right. Let's see if we can see the whole interface here. Yes, I think we've got everything. Okay. So this is the opening screen. You can see, first thing to see is that basically we're breaking things down into total spending, MDAs, this represents central government spending, and regions, which represents local government spending. So these are basically the two tiers of spending that we're actually dealing with, and they follow slightly different models. We're also dealing with several different classification structures. What we've discovered about visualising developing economies is that these kinds of classification structures tend to be quite highly politicised. So what you can see here is that this is actually spending by purpose. So this is really what it gets spent on the sort of at the ground level. But if you go to the top and look at sort of sector, you'll see there's this enormous bubble called other, and everybody always comments on other straight away. And all that means is that basically it just doesn't fall into this particular classification of judiciary, HIV/AIDS, energy administration, etc., etc. But if you actually look at spending by function, you actually get a much more complete picture, because this fits into a much more strict hierarchy of spending. And if you actually look at it in a bar format, then you can see central government and local government, and you can see how the distribution actually changes. You've also got this format called type, which is basically, I don't know if you can see down here, that's development spending and recurrent spending, and development spending tends to be associated with kind of capital infrastructure type projects, and recurrent spending is more about sort of waging people and giving them, you know, sort of ongoing expenses. So you can see that it sort of breaks down sort of roughly sort of, I guess, 2 to 3 to 1, something like that. We've also got this dimension called cluster. This relates to sort of kind of pillarised type spending projects, which relate to things like healthcare and infrastructure development. So we've got all of these different classification structures which kind of describe the spending. So that's really the first thing to talk about. So if we actually move on to the MDAs, I mentioned that this actually follows a strict hierarchy. So we can actually make this into a rather appealing bubble chart. So all of these, each ministry falls into one of these 7 descriptions. So we can actually describe this through this hierarchy. And if, for instance, we actually drill down into one of these areas, then we can start to see what all of these departments and ministries are underneath each of the each of these functions. And you can see actually here's almost 16% of the budget goes on public debt and general services. But what I find quite interesting about this is that if we actually look at this in terms of what they're actually spending that on, then half of that is wages, or a third of that is wages. I'm not quite sure how that works, but anyway, I'm sure there's a good reason for that. Something which I think is actually quite interesting about this, I'm going to go back to the bar view at the moment, and I'm going to go to defence, because I have a sort of suspicion. A few days ago, the client actually asked us to remove something from the drill down here. Now, if we actually go, you can see that we're actually visualising things by sector and cluster at this level, and you can see that in the defence spending, there's a certain amount of money which is coming from the HIV/AIDS budget or the water budget or something like that. So basically, if you actually drill down there, they've actually asked us to take that out of the detail level. So I'm sort of wondering whether there's some sort of whether they've actually asked us to take that out because it's a little bit too much information. So who knows? But yeah. So anyway, this kind of should give you an idea of how you can sort of look at things in different ways and different perspectives, and actually get a feeling for what all this data actually means. So another way of looking at things, obviously, is when you're actually looking at regional spending, you can start to look at things on maps. So we've actually got, this is, since we're only halfway through this project, we're actually, this is not quite as developed in so much detail as we're intending to. We've actually got some polygons that we're going to be incorporating into this so that you can actually really drill down into these regional areas and find out a lot more about what's going on at the ground level. And I think this is something which, you know, people are going to find very interesting in their local areas, that they can sort of really find out about what's actually happening there. Yeah, another thing is that you'll see we've only got 2 years' worth of data here at the moment. Now, this has been quite interesting. The first year that we actually had was 2009-10, and this was by far the best developed spreadsheet that we had. We were able to derive the entire structure for this interface from this particular spreadsheet. It had something like 80,000 data items. The following year, similar size, but nowhere as well defined. So we had to do a fair amount of projecting of, you know, making projections from what we actually had from the 2009-10 data onto 2010-11. Similar story going backwards. We're going to have, at the moment, we've got about 150,000 data items in this. When we actually go backwards, by the time we've finished, I think we're going to have more like 500,000. We're going to take this back to about 2006, I think. So we're going to have 5 or 6 years worth of data, and we're going to be able to arrange that on timelines, and we're going to be able to sort of bring in much more rich interactivity. I'm thinking, for instance, the timeline playhead that we actually saw earlier on is something we can use to animate some of these graphs. So basically, the idea is to actually, you know, use this very simple framework to actually engage people with where the money is actually going. Yeah, a couple of other things besides. Because this is actually in Tanzania, a lot of these graphics have to be suitable for print, so we've been sort of doing our best. We are, as we're working on it, we're doing our best to make sure the colours are things that will actually perform reasonably well on, you know, sort of local colour printers. And also, you'll notice there's this right-click on the graphs to download the data. So any one of these graphs, if you right-click on it, you can actually get a CSV file of what you're actually looking at that moment. That particular graph you'll have all the data for. So that is basically what we've actually been working on for this particular project. So I mean, does anybody have any sort of questions to ask about this project before we actually move on? Because I think this is an area which is quite sort of interesting, and while I've got it in front of me, I like to sort of find out whether people have any comments about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, so you're saying the client asked you to actually remove some of the visibility inside the report itself. I mean, isn't that actually changing the truth at the source itself and hiding the data, like, from the base up? Well, that's why I sort of draw it to your attention, because you know, at every single level, even though you're sort of working on it, if you kind of go in at the outset with this idea of actually being as analytical as you can, as soon as you start selecting metrics for what you actually want to show, you're asserting an editorial, some particular editorial selection on that, and saying, okay, we're going to show this and not that. And you know, I was actually, you know, I was slightly concerned when I heard this request, because I felt that was a particular interesting area and something that you might actually want to go and sort of, you know, look at a bit closely. Now, if you do look closely, the story is still there. It's just not as visible. I mean, you know, you have to have a slightly keener eye to see it. So are those data connectors still open? Can anyone connect to the data and do his own report? That's a good question, actually. I reckon you probably could. I think you probably could. I haven't tested that yet, but thank you, because I'll go back to the office and I'm going to test that and see if that comes out on the CSV file, because if you can, that would be good, yes.
Hi there. Interested about the printable aspect of this, because obviously it automatically makes it not interactive anymore in terms of being able to explore the data and that. What's the intention behind that? Is it just for internal governmental use when they're sending reports to each other, or is it for printing out to leading libraries?
It's basically because not everybody in Tanzania has access to a printer, and you know, if you want to actually make this accessible to people in some of these regions, if we just have a look at the regional area again, then basically, I mean, some of these areas are sort of very sparsely populated, and there's not actually very much, you know, there in terms of infrastructure. So if people don't have access to the internet or something like that, then you need to be able to give them the information in some other way. And that was actually something they were quite clear about. So I think there's a kind of appropriate technology aspect to it, is that, you know, if you can't give them the interactivity, then at least you can give them the printouts.
I think it's quite important for even in more developed countries and places where there's a lot of connectivity. I think people, you know, people in this room, we're all connected by just about everything that we've got on us. But there's a lot of people that still don't have any kind of, you know, older people or poorer people or anything. It's still access that kind of stuff's limited, you know, unless you go to a place like a library and have the intention to, you know how to use something like this. I think it's quite overlooked quite often in, you know, places like the UK.
Good point. Yeah.
How adaptable is that platform for other spending data, for other countries or even for other local areas? And is this open sourced in any way? Is it something other people can use?
There is an open source version of something which I'm not a big fan of, to be honest, on the web. The Where Does My Money Go prototype has actually been open sourced. To be honest, it's not quite as flexible as this platform. What we've done here is we've developed something that basically we're hoping that this is going to translate to other budgets where, for instance, you know, maybe sort of other developing world budgets, because this model might work quite well for that. And we have been working to make all these visualization platforms as data neutral as possible. So the underlying engine for this doesn't actually know that it's Tanzanian data. It just knows there's a data structure and that there's a layer on top of that which is actually doing all the interpretation to sort of grind into the visualizations. So the more of these we do, the more transferable we hope to make them. I'm afraid I can't promise that any of this will ever be open source, but I mean, we are sort of working with various different ways of actually, you know, making it accessible to people, like, for instance, open APIs and, you know, ways that that can actually be exploited. So, yeah.
Hello. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the Tanzanian government expectations are of this project in terms of engaging, you know, the wider public and things like that. I mean, are there any, or is it just?
Oh, right. Okay. It's probably a good idea to actually have a talk about the. Let's see how the connectivity is working, because we can have a look at the NGO that commissioned this. They're called Twaweza. And here's their website. Oh, that's Twaweza.net. There it is. Yeah. And they've also got another website, which is kind of the subdivision, which this has been. So yes, here we go. Basically, this is their website. They're based in Dar es Salaam, and they've been doing. I think, from the point of view of what they actually expect from this project, I think it's really just sort of about transparency and just making all of this stuff more open and more accessible to people. I think, from what I understand, they're actually an awful lot more interested in actually discovering how money gets sort of worked around in the regions and actually sort of, improving people's lives at that level, which is why actually distributing stuff at regional level is becoming sort of more and more important. From the point of view, from our concept of sort of government transparency, perhaps we might want to look a little bit more at the ministries. But, maybe that's the sort of thing where you might get a little bit too much transparency. I don't know. So, yeah. Does that answer the question? Okay. Anything else? I mean, it's really just kind of closing business at this point, because what I'd like to really say now is basically, I feel very, very strongly that in order to make tools which are really, really useful and empowering, we really, really need to sort of learn how how shaping data actually works. This, I heard this described by Ben Soberly of Stamen as information physics, and I think this is really quite a nice way of actually describing what it is we're doing, which is really framing things in the sense that we need to sort of look for new ways of actually describing this, kind of finding the sort of meta stories around these things, because shaping this data leads us into that process, which is all about, not necessarily about the events themselves that you're describing or the things that you're describing, but about their unfolding trajectory and what's actually happening underneath that surface. And to really learn and understand that, we need to be sort of much more concerned with analysis and perhaps less concerned about you know, the beauty and aesthetics and the artistry. And I say this not to belittle people who are making art with data, because I think that's a great way to understand it as well. But from the point of view of actually sort of using it, I think we're perhaps too hung up on this sort of culture of kind of art and design and being on message to really practice effective data analysis at the moment. And I'd like to see in future going forward that we can actually approach construction of visualizations and tools for data analysis much, much more with that in mind. And that's basically why I've really sort of left this last word to Edward Tufte, who is, after all, our patron saint. So that's really kind of concludes pretty much what I would like to say. And yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. You've had questions all the way through. Do you want to
if there's any more questions, then people...
Is there any more questions,
or
or
I don't
would
think
you
there are,
like to
probably not.
all go and get yourselves a cup of coffee?